Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Krista Fabian D. Castro. I'm the Senior Manager for Artist Engagement and Programming at Creative Capital. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a white female with long curly hair. I have a purple scarf and a bookshelf in the background. I'm pleased to be joined here by Kenny Fries and Alison O'Daniel, who I will introduce further in a moment. For those of you who are not familiar with Creative Capital, we support innovative and adventurous artists across the country through funding, counsel, and career development services. As part of our mission to amplify artists' voices and provide tools and community for artists to thrive, we are pleased to host these online workshops and conversations. You can learn more, see upcoming workshops, and subscribe to our newsletter at our website, which is creative-capital.org. Before we begin, I wanted to take a moment to recognize that even in this time of COVID-19, when we are all physically distant, that we are grounded and connected together through this workshop to Creative Capital. Creative Capital's location, while currently referred to as Lower Manhattan in New York City, is on the ancestral unceded homelands of the Lenape people. In saying this, we recognize the continual displacement and violence perpetrated against Indigenous people and people of color in the United States. We are aware that these kind of acknowledgements can be misused as stand-ins for actual decolonization work, which is something for us to bear in mind as we go forward in our ongoing commitment to accountability and to equity. We hope that all of you tuning in will feel welcomed and included in this work from your own respective places. As a step towards that, we encourage you to visit the resource native-land.ca. We'll place that in the chat. And also we welcome you to introduce yourselves and, if you can, the places you're dialing in from in the chat as well. The topic for today's conversation is access in content and form. It's a dialogue between two Creative Capital awardees, writer Kenny Fries and visual artist and filmmaker Alison O'Daniel. As artists who identify as disabled, Kenny and Alison know the importance of access to buildings, sound, films, books, websites, and especially during the current pandemic, protection and care. Kenny and Alison are here to talk about how their intersectional identities enter their work, the importance of disability representation and role models, and their upcoming creative collaboration on a film based on Kenny's poem sequence, In the Gardens of Japan. We also welcome our American Sign Language interpreters, Trisha and Leticia from TRJ Bridges. We intend the session to be as interactive as possible, so we encourage everyone joining to use the YouTube chat, both to connect with each other and to ask questions of our guest. Our staff will filter the comments through to the guest, and Kenny and Alison will try to answer as many as possible in our short time together. Also, just a quick note that the recording of the session will be available on the Creative Capital YouTube channel afterwards. Thanks very much for joining us. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Kenny and to Alison.
Hello, I'm Kenny Fries, for people that don't know. I am a white man with short black hair, wearing a purple polo shirt. My background is my messy office here in Berlin. It's a white wall with some really unorganized bookshelves. And I wear glasses that actually don't help me see very well these days because I'm getting old. Okay, so just tell you a little bit how we're gonna do this. I'm gonna start talking comments probably around 7 minutes or so, and then I'm gonna hand it over to Alison and she's gonna talk a bit. And then Alice and I have prepared some questions to have a conversation with each other, and then we're gonna open it up to all of you. But if you have questions and comments during, please, do that. Don't wait. Just put them in the chat. Okay, so I could I could talk for hours about the subject, but I've narrowed it down to a few things that I wanted to frame the conversation tonight. Okay, so for my work itself, it really started with Adrienne Rich, the poet. As a disabled gay writer, Rich's work spoke to me in a way that I didn't first fully understand. Of lines in her poems about confronting emptiness of walls, rooms in which we wake up early while everyone else was sleeping, and encountering myths in which my name did not appear, resonated with my experience as a disabled writer. And when I read Rich's poem, Contradiction Tracking Poems, which I'm going to read you a section of tonight, it really resonated with me. And this is from Adrienne Rich's Contradictions Tracking Poems. The problem unstated till now is how to live in a damaged body in a world where pain is meant to be gagged, uncured, ungrieved over. The problem is to connect, without hysteria, the pain of any one's body with the pain of the body's world. For it is the body's world they are trying to destroy forever. The best world is the body's world, filled with creatures, filled with dread, misshapen so, yet the best we have, our raft among the abstract worlds, and how I long to live on this earth, walking her boundaries, never counting the cost. And what's interesting is when I first encountered Rich's words as an undergraduate in around 1980, I didn't know she was disabled. It wasn't until I included her work in Staring Back, the Disability Experience from the Inside Out, the anthology of US writers, disabled writers I edited in 1997, that I outed Rich as disabled. She lived with rheumatoid arthritis, which led to an acquaintance and correspondence we had during the following decades. The other important event in my early years as a disabled writer relates specifically to language, the language I needed to write about disability. To me, disabled since birth, disabled was the norm. There would be no mention of the able-bodied in my writing. From that moment on, I used the term disabled and non-disabled. The next important step was community. An important event in this trajectory was in 1994 when I was invited to take part in the Chautauqua on Disability and Performance at the Mark Taper Forum in Los Angeles, which was organized by Vicki Lewis, who was then the head of Other Voices, the Taper's program for disabled writers, which was part of their constellation of programs for underrepresented writers at the time. At the Chautauqua, not only did I meet disabled writers of my generation, including Ann Finger and Susan Nussbaum, Lynn Manning, and Ayufemi Falayan, but also disabled historian Paul Longmore and Douglas Martin, who helped write some of the laws which allowed disabled people to live independent lives. It was Vicki Lewis's genius not only to gather together disabled writers and artists, but to situate the work we were doing within the context of disability history and disability rights. In the introduction to Staring Back, I write, returning home, I knew I was not alone in my struggle to give voice to the disability experience, an experience which throughout history had been marginalized or co-opted, if not ignored. So thus began my attempt to bring disability and disabled writers into the so-called mainstream, to the center of both human experience and culture, where I know it properly belongs. Over the years, through research, I learned of the centrality of disability in other cultures, most importantly in my Creative Capital project in the Province of the Gods, in which, for example, I talk about how blind biwa singers roaming throughout Japan spread the Japanese language throughout the country. I also started to realize that forms and structures I used in my work interrupted the mainstream narrative of the eradication and cure of disability, as well as a predominant and still prevalent narrative that basically answers the non-disabled's questions and concerns rather than our own. In The History of My Shoes and the Evolution of Darwin's Theory, I write, disability studies theorist Leonard J. Davis shows how when we speak of disability, we associate it with a story, a place in a narrative. A person became deaf, became blind, was born blind, became quadriplegic. The impairment becomes part of a sequential narrative. And by doing this, we think of disability as linked to individualism and the individual story. What is actually a physical fact becomes a story with a hero or a victim. Disability becomes divorced from the cultural context and becomes the problem of the individual, not a category defined by the society. The dialectic of normalcy, for someone to be normal, someone has to be not normal, is kept intact. What also happens is that disability is too often used as a metaphor, not depicted as an actual lived experience. We see this in writers from as ancient as the Greeks, in Oedipus, for example, where blindness, the blind characters become metaphors for knowledge and knowing and quote unquote seeing. We also see this more contemporarily in authors like Carson McCullers, in which the disabled characters become stand-ins for otherness, or in Jose Saramago's ubiquitous Blindness and countless other works. And when this occurs, as it does quite often, mainstream reviewers and critics do not have the knowledge and context to unpack this egregious use of disability. There are more current examples, and they can be found in popular works like Taylor Mack's A 24-Decade History of Popular Music, during which Mack compels the audience to put on blindfolds, unleashing stereotypes and tropes of blindness, or a recent Deutsche Oper Berlin production of Zemlinsky's opera The Dwarf, based on an Oscar Wilde story, which cast a non-singing actor of small stature who was eventually killed by his non-disabled singing doppelganger, and Simon McBurney's adaptation of the Stefan Zweig novel, Beware of Pity, which has been produced across the world. In Bruce Norris's Pulitzer Prize-winning play Clybourne Park, it is the deaf character who does not get to tell her story. There has been little critical discourse that successfully deals with how disability is co-opted by these esteemed artists. And that brings me to something that Elizabeth Sweeney, who is a visual artist and who is currently the program officer for Deaf and Disability Arts in the Canada Council for the Arts, brings to us in a handout that she used to give to my students called Reflective Questions and Strategies for Presenting and Critiquing Disability Art. And I want to share with you some of Elizabeth's questions to keep these in mind. So Elizabeth calls this the quick and dirty pocket guide to analyzing disability themed art. And she's mainly here talking about curatorial exhibits, but I think it works for all art of all kinds. So she asked these questions. 1, who benefits? Career, media attention, ego, reputation, financially, etc. 2, who is in control of the message and the art form? 3, will disabled people benefit directly or indirectly from being involved in this work and by viewing it? Or is this really about enlightening non-disabled people? 4, what is the power relationship between the subject, the artist, and the audience? 5, what is the contribution of the disabled artists in the work? Is it passive or active? Do they have control of the project, and how are they being presented? 6, does this work challenge current assumptions and stereotypes about disability, or does it reinforce them? A, if it is the latter, reconsider the question, who benefits? 7, have assumptions about disability and/or disabled people been made from a non-disabled person about the direction of this piece? And 8, are disabled people treated as artists or subjects? Are they named and recognized as individual contributors? And she says, if they are not, reconsider questions 1, 3, and 4. So I have some questions for people who are present tonight and those who will watch this event later when it's available online. Have you participated in exhibits, readings, festivals, etc., where there were no disabled artists involved? Or if you are a disabled artist, were you the only disabled artist included? Were there disabled artists on the grants panel on which you served? Access does not only mean access to buildings, sound, films, books, websites, and especially during the current pandemic, protection and care, but it means that disabled artists need to be represented in pages, on stages, on walls, on panels, as critics, curators, as arts leaders and administrators, and in other gatekeeper positions. So I want to finish my remarks where I started, but with a little twist. Because I started with my own history as a disabled writer, how I came to write about disability in the way I do. But like the 1994 Chautauqua in Los Angeles, much of disability history and disability culture is not known. For the past 7 years, I've worked on bringing a little too known history of Action T4, the Nazi program that killed 300,000 disabled people during its official time and its aftermath. About my forthcoming books, Stumbling Over History, Disability, and the Holocaust, Steve Kozisto has said, contemporary nonfiction treatments of serious human rights tragedies, many previously unknown to a broad swath of readers, such as Peter Balakian's The Burning Tigris about the Armenian genocide, Adam Hochschild's King Leopold's Ghost, Belgian Massacres in the Congo, and more recently, David Grant's Killers of the Flower Moon, Crimes Against the Osage Nation, have captured significant literary attention. The Nazi Action T4 program was the forerunner to the Holocaust, yet it remains little known outside of academic research. In my recently completed What Happened Here in the Summer of 1940, a series of 6 interrelated videos based on excerpts from Stumbling Over History, my video editor and I decided to use an empty, dark screen at moments where the historical record is not yet known, forcing an uncomfortable blankness for viewers, as uncomfortable as the history itself. This history has become even more relevant and resonant during the current COVID pandemic, during which eugenic ideas and practices, often under the guise of bioethics, threatens the lives of disabled people through triage crisis protocols of who would receive care, the rampant viral infections in nursing homes and other institutions, which account for an estimated 40% of deaths, and there are still no mass protests about this, and the lack of understanding of how safety precautions often do not include the actual lives of those of us with disabilities. And last June, I wrote and recorded an audio text, Disability Can Save Your Life, that talks about this. But many artists, including disabled artists, still do not know the various histories and intersections of disability culture. In a recent conversation I had with Carrie Sandall, a preeminent disability performance scholar who teaches in the PhD program in disability studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago, Carrie mentioned that she encounters many younger disabled artists who spend much time and energy on reinventing the wheel because they do not yet know what has come before them. There are many reasons this happens, including a historical lack of access to education and professional arts training, and a lack of disabled role models as mentor and faculty, just for starters. So as a privileged pioneer in disability arts, I've taken on the challenge in a recently awarded 3-year multi-project grant from the Canada Council for the Arts. All of the projects to be funded by this grant are collaborations and look toward building relationships with a younger generation of disabled writers and artists. One of the projects included in the grants is the collaboration with my co-host tonight, Alison O'Daniel, which will be a film based on my poem Secrets in the Gardens of Japan, which we can talk about a bit, but not much because it's still just an idea. We plan to begin filming in 2022 and we'll premiere the film in Japan in 2023. So I met Alison a year and a half ago when I was a Creative Capital Artist Advisor, and she was part of the cohort I mentored through their first year of their Creative Capital Award. Just from reading her short description of a Creative Capital project, The Tuba Thieves, I knew I had found another kindred artist. I was thrilled when she agreed to our collaboration, and I'm honored to be in conversation with Alison tonight. So take it away, Alison.
Okay. Hi. Thank you so much, Kenny. I was nodding my head so much throughout that, but you couldn't see me, so. So I am not going to spend very much time. I just want to introduce myself. I'm Alison O'Daniel. I am a white woman with long brown wavy hair. I'm wearing round gray glasses and have on a denim shirt, and I'm sitting in front of a white wall. And I am in Alameda, California right now in the Bay Area. So I am on the unceded territory of the Ohlone people. And yeah, and thank you, Creative Capital, for having this conversation. I'm really excited about it and very happy to be here. So I just wanted to start out by saying a little bit about my experience with my sort of movement into identifying as disabled. So I am hard of hearing. We believe, my parents and I believe, or I've been told, that I was born with my hearing, but they did not figure it out until I was about 3. My family moved from a 1-story house to a 2-story house, and I started falling down the stairs, and that was kind of the final clue after a lot of behavioral problems that they were trying to figure out. And when I started falling down the stairs, they started to think that maybe there was something going on with my balance or inner ear. And so after visits to the audiologist and ear, nose, and throat doctor, I was diagnosed with binaural hearing loss and received my first pair of hearing aids at the age of 3. I remember getting my first pair of hearing aids, like I have like a deeply seared in sensory memory of everything. I remember my audiologist's pantyhose. I remember the color of her shoes. I remember thinking that I had this picture in my mind at the age of 3 that they were going to be clear. And I remember seeing them in her hand, and they were like Caucasian flesh tone. And I remember thinking that was strange. And then basically my parents were really positive about it. So I remember I have a very early memory of them encouraging me to like show them off and show and tell. And I think that went along with my sort of precocious personality. It just never occurred to me to not think of it as like, I don't know, it just like became very normalized in my life. And my hearing was, as a child, was just a thing. I don't actually have very many memories besides getting my hearing aids of my hearing being an issue, really. Besides things that were, like as a child getting into the shower with them on and then it being a catastrophe because they were expensive and, we would have to get new ones, or a childhood dog that ate them once, So I have stories like that, like these kind of really goofy stories, but it wasn't until I was in middle school, which started kind of a trajectory of having difficulty with teachers, actually. And I have this invisible disability where it's not evident in my speech, it's not really evident in my daily life, and yet my daily life is very impacted by my hearing, and it shows up in all of these what seemingly covert ways. And so I remember a 7th grade teacher, I completely just came in without any homework, had no idea that there had even been an assignment, and I remember her accusing me of making it up, of using my hearing as like basically, lying about my hearing. And I remember being, just crushed by that. I think that was one of those, and completely sort of without language to defend myself or to even really understand it. It just seemed so unjust. And then fast forward to actually, like throughout school, I had little experiences like that. But once I was in grad school and started to really realize that I needed certain access that wasn't being made available, and I would start to talk to people in disability offices, I would get similar kind of accusations. And it was really traumatic and really, it had it shaped me in a really kind of, maybe led to some of my empowerment, and it was frustrating but there was kind of this through line of being told that I was asking for things that were perceived as beyond my needs or as too expensive. I was told frequently that like any sort of assistance was going to be too expensive, which I've now learned is like a very common thing that a lot of people with disabilities encounter. So what's interesting for me is around the time of grad school, I was also starting to really have this very interesting shift where I was simultaneously really considering the ways that I had been like psychosocially impacted without really realizing it by my hearing, and feeling sort of social isolation in certain ways, even while in contradiction being, you know, very social and having like an engaged social life. But I did always feel this kind of sort of like palpable distance, or a slight feeling of kind of being behind. And so confusion and frustration were these big elements of my life, and I started to slowly kind of connect them to my hearing. It took me a very long time to understand that, and through that connection I started to also become really interested in it, and I just slowly was becoming more and more kind of observant and curious about these things that had just been normal to me. And when I was 26, I went to the Skowhegan School of Art and Painting and Sculpture, I just forgot what it was called, to that residency for the summer of 2007. And when it's a residency in Maine, and it's basically in kind of in the forest. And I remember 3 nights being there and being really attached to a flashlight. And then on night 3, somebody told me, you know, if you stop using the flashlight, your eyes are going to adjust. And they did. So I stopped using my flashlight, and I realized that I could see in the forest. And so I spent almost the entire summer going out alone in the middle of the night into the forest, and just marveling at what was happening with my eyes. And it was a way for me to start to think about my hearing in a way that during that summer I couldn't really make sense of. But I was just, the entire summer, I was so amazed at this sort of shift in perception. And I knew that it had something to do with how I had kind of always experienced my hearing, but I didn't yet really have language for that or know what was going to come out of that. I also want to share a poem. It's a poem that I always have next to my computer when I'm editing my films. And it's called Being a Person by the poet William Stafford. And it's, well, I'll just read it. So, be a person here, stand by the river, invoke the owls, invoke winter, then spring. Let any season that wants to come here make its own, let any season that wants to come here make its own call. After that sound goes away, wait. A slow bubble rises through the earth and begins to include sky, stars, all space, even the outracing, expanding thought. Come back and hear the little sound again. Suddenly the stream you are having matches everyone's dream, and the result is the world. If a different call came, there wouldn't be any world, or you, or the river, or the owls calling. How you stand here is important. How you listen for the next things to happen. How you breathe. So I also want to share 2 videos. They're not my videos. And so I'm just going to put them into the chat for you to watch after, because I'm not going to share my video. But the first video that I want to share is called Amazing Art, and it's by the artists Catherine Araniello and Aaron Williamson. Both are disabled artists. Aaron Williamson is deaf, and Catherine Araniello has spinal, I actually forget the name of it. In the video, it's in there. She has a spinal issue. And this video they collaborated on, and it's them making art in like an art therapy class for disabled people. And it's very, it's quite tongue-in-cheek. And I think that part of the reason that I really like this video is because it's disabled people representing a kind of very familiar representation that can happen of people with disabilities that is, that can be, you know, sappy and very, very, like, you know, I think there can be, I think we have been exposed for a long time to a lot of videos that represent people with disabilities as something to be pitied. And so they're kind of making fun of that. So, and then the other video that I wanted to share is a video by Key and Peele. And this video is a satire of American Idol, and it uses disability in I think related way to the way that Catherine Arniello and Erin Williamson do, but I think it's very interesting because Key and Peele do not have disabilities, but it's I believe that they're that one of the things that's really smart about their show is how intersectionally aware they are. And so I think they draw from identity issues of race to talk about and represent disability in this particular skit that I think is really brilliant and quite funny. So enjoy both of those. And then I have a bunch of questions that I'd love to open the conversation with Kenny, where I think that we'll get into a lot more detail. So that's all I'll say. And then Kenny, come back.
I'm back.
Okay, great. So can I ask you the first question?
Sure.
Okay, so I am curious how you self-define beyond being a writer. And then also, how do your intersectional identities show up or inform the content and form of your work?
I think I touched a little bit on that earlier, but to be a little bit more specific, if I can be, I'll just tell you something that I find very interesting. When I first started writing back when I was young, I was looked at as a gay writer. I was never seen, that was my niche. And over time, I've become more known, I think, as a disabled writer. And I always found that interesting because I'm the same person. I'm writing about mostly the same things. And so I think that was an interesting shift, and I don't quite know how or why that happened. So that's one thing. My first book, my first nonfiction book, Body Remembered, deals with the intersecting identities of being gay, disabled, and Jewish. And I was once asked by it was Wisconsin Public Radio when I was doing publicity for the book. The host asked me, why would somebody who wasn't disabled, gay, or Jewish be interested in reading the book? And I luckily had a pithy answer ready, which I often do, even if I censor them sometimes. But I didn't censor it that time. I basically said the book is about the relationship between the body and memory, and we all have bodies and we all remember. So everybody has a way into this book. Mm-hmm. But interestingly, you talked about structure. The form of the book, I think, is it's very nonlinear. Most of my work, and so my last book, is nonlinear. And I think that it's also a book of questions and not answers, which I relate to actually being Jewish, which I think is a question of a culture of questions, not answers. But I think that not only does the form of the book, the structure of the book relate to how we remember things, but I think it's also because the multiple identities, as I mentioned earlier, just don't follow a traditional sequential narrative. Mm-hmm. I guess that would be my answer.
Great.
My turn to ask you a question. So since I first learned about your work, I became so interested in how you redefine sound in your films, especially in The Tuba Thieves, which you're currently working on. Mm-hmm. I was also taken how in the narrative you create in the film, it's not the typical narrative of who stole the tubas, but a narrative that I think is related to how you redefine sound in the film. So in other words, it seems that the redefinition of sound and the atypical narrative are tied together. Is this something you thought of before working on the film, or you discovered this in the process of making the film?
Yeah, so The Tuba Thieves comes from the fact that in 2011, I heard this story on the radio in Los Angeles about these tubas that had been stolen from a high school. And when So I heard that story, and then about 2 weeks passed, and I heard another story about another high school that had tubas stolen. And I was really struck by the fact that in both of those stories, the way that they had reported it was really focused on the thieves. Like, it was this just, who are the thieves? Why are they doing this? What, I totally understand why that is the question. I also had those questions, but I think just at the time I happened to hear these stories, I was coming off of finishing my first film, called Night Sky, which I had made with a cast and crew that was from completely deaf to completely hearing, and then a bunch of people in between on that spectrum. And I was really moved and feeling very sensitive to my kind of big takeaway in that experience, which was just that everybody's experience with sound was so varied. And it made me come out of my ears and my head a little bit and start to see the world and the world of sound through the ears of a bunch of people that I had just worked with. And that just felt like full of so much possibility to me to think through this kind of community that I was just starting to be a part of, and just how varied everybody's experience with sound and hearing was. And then also, like, this other layer is that I was also feeling really guilty about having worked with my composer at the time. His name was Ethan Frederick Green, and he had made the score for that film. And that relationship with the composer, like, through the edit, he was just on this project and making changes. And I really had this feeling, I think the guilt was kind of pushing me to want to flip the script a little bit and work as a director, like a composer, and ask a composer to basically direct me. And so that was kind of floating around in my mind. When I heard about these tuba thefts, I was really, really curious about how the loss of the tubas quite literally just changed the dynamics of the marching band, the sound of the marching band. And I started reaching out to these marching band directors at these high schools who had had their tubas stolen. And I started going to the high schools. Anybody who would have me, I would go and meet the students and meet the band directors and, ask them questions and just listen. And I was, I was like, I loved every single one of these students that I met, and I loved their stories. I loved their assumptions about the thefts. It was so different than what was being reported. And I decided that I was going to make this film called The Tuba Thieves. I knew, because I had heard these stories over and over, and this obsession with the thieves, I knew it was not going to be about the thieves. That was not the story I wanted to tell. And I knew that the process of making the film, that I really wanted to do this like switch of the director and the composer. So I knew I wanted to foreground this experience of listening, and to think of listening as moving beyond the ear and basically making my whole body into this kind of like information sponge, and letting like the writing of a narrative come through, just like anecdotal stories coming my way. And they did. I mean, so many things started coming my way, and I was just open to all of them kind of getting jammed into this film together, and letting the film almost be like a container for anything that I was learning about that was interesting. So I was learning about these historical concerts. I found out that this woman who had been in my first film, who's deaf, that she was a drummer. All the students and their stories were really interesting. So just the Tuba Thieves became this kind of like vessel in a way for any sort of stories about sound that I was hearing. And I think, honestly, it's a reflection of just my own experience of my relationship to being hard of hearing. And, hearing is always complicated for me. Like, sometimes it's really hard. Sometimes it's really frustrating. Sometimes it's super funny. Sometimes it's, it's just so many things. And I was much more interested in, I was starting to become really interested at that time in exploring really my perspective of how I hear. And so I honestly, it never occurred to me that I was dealing with sound in an interesting way. I was just dealing with sound in the way that I experienced sound. And it was occurring to me that it was like, what occurred to me was that I was interested, not that it was interesting, if that makes sense. Like, to me, that was a profound shift of of recognizing that this thing that was so frustrating and so socially awkward, it's constantly socially awkward. I have these conversations with my producer all the time where the next day I do something kind of wrong and she's like, we were going to do this. And I'm just like, I don't even know how we ended up here. And I just always kind of have to come to this conclusion that it's my hearing. I feel lost so frequently, or like, I feel like I've done something wrong or heard something wrong so frequently. And so I think to just get out of the kind of feeling mired in that, like it being negative, I had to start to find a way to just be like, choose to be interested. And that's, I guess, the answer to like my relationship to specifically to redefining sound. So the atypical narrative just came through. You know, it's not like I set out to redefine sound. So
as you're talking, I was reminded of our conversation, which landed up being in my audio text, Disability Can Save Your Life. You were the person that alerted me to the difficulties you had with certain COVID restrictions, because you said you walking 6 feet from somebody and having a conversation was just not doable.
Yeah.
And masks, you couldn't read lips anymore.
Yeah.
So you were very instrumental in my understanding of how hard of hearing people were affected by the pandemic in a way that I wouldn't have known before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and also I think the way that we've realized this funny switch of how you say that on Zoom for you, like it's almost like it takes away the visibility of the disability. And for me, Zoom suddenly makes it not necessarily more visible, but just really, it's so foregrounded. It's just so constant, everything I have to do to set up my computer with like captions and most of the time, closed captions, like AI closed captions are usually terrible. There are some that are good, but well, no, there's only one that's good, but in my experience. But anyway, so I'm going to ask you another question.
Okay.
Okay. So what does access mean to you in your work? So not in the larger ADA built world, but in, I don't know if you would say like the worlds you write or we don't have to say that expression, but just in the work that you make.
Oh, it's an interesting question because I never really thought of it that way. I mean, when I think about it now, I think about I also think, who am I writing for? Who am I giving access to the story? And a lot of that has to do with how I talk about certain things that I assume another disabled person would know, but a non-disabled reader, which I assume will be the majority of readers because there are more people that are non-disabled in the world. So basically, I never know how much information I need to give to a general reader. Mm-hmm. And I think that, is an interesting, it's almost a reverse thing. It's how am I providing access to my work for the non-disabled, not for the disabled people. And I always think about how to balance that giving of that information, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I love that. I so love that answer.
When somebody came up to me at a reading on my book tour 3 years ago that really, really fascinated me. We had interpreters for the reading, and somebody asked if I ever considered doing a signed version of my work or having that out, published or, presented online, whatever it would be. And I thought that was really, really interesting. And it's something that I would be very interested in pursuing somehow. I imagine it would, funding would be an issue. But I thought of that. It was very, very interesting. I'd never thought about it, but I became very, very interested in it. So yeah, that was an interesting thing. We had a question that kind of related to this. You touched on it earlier, but we've talked about how you and I about how your disability, this whole idea of invisible disabilities, and especially when you were growing up, and in many situations you're able to pass as non-disabled, and now that we're using Zoom. but do you want to talk a little bit more? I see somebody was interested in talking more about, invisible disabilities.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting to think not just about invisible disability, but one of the things that I really love is that a lot of deaf teachers that I've met, like deaf sign language teachers, have commented on, there's this distinction between like little d deaf and big D deaf. And so little d deaf is like people who lose their hearing but don't really have any engagement with deaf community. They're not a part of deaf culture. And then big D deaf is people who are culturally deaf and who are, very aware of deaf history and are around a lot of deaf people and like live a very deaf life. And so I've had teachers who've talked about hard of hearing people moving from little d deaf to big D deaf. And I think on some level, that's a really interesting parallel to invisible disabilities, that in some ways I have this invisible disability. And even growing up, like when I would fill out forms and it would be like, do you have a disability? I would always have this thing of like, does that mean me? My impulse is to check yes, but I don't know if like what this question is implying. Is there like a percentage? Should I I've always had this kind of feeling of sort of like, where's the line? Is there a line? And as I've gotten older, I've loved so much meeting so many people who identify as disabled and realizing the self-identification and a sort of empowered relationship to being disabled is this interesting movement from invisible to visible. And so even though my lived experience is invisible in a lot of ways in my life, but in my career, in my art, it's visible because I talk about it, because I put it out there, because I talk about my work in relation to disability. And then, I've also, a curator I worked with very early in my career, Amanda Kasha, I used to have really interesting conversations with her that really helped me think through this about, identifying as disabled or not. And I didn't even realize that even in debating about that I was carrying on a conversation that I think has happened, that has been very present in the deaf world for a long time, about deafness not being a disability, as if disability is a pejorative. And my experience being hard of hearing and not being fully in the deaf community. And also I think something that's been happening, like a kind of wider, more integrated conversation across disabilities really in the last few years, that's been becoming more and more accepted. I feel like this word disability, at least when I say it, it's like so positive. I feel like thrilled about it. Like it's really one of the things in my life that I feel like integrating with other people and all of these varieties of lived experience. It's like some of the most interesting and engaging conversation I have in my life. So yeah, that's kind of a long, multifaceted answer, but yeah. So Kenny, I'm aware it's 1:50 and we have gotten a few questions in the chat, and should we, I had this one question I did really want to ask you, which is about going, and actually somebody in the chat mentioned this too, but I've heard you frequently mention being tired of fighting the advocacy fight. And I've heard other disabled people who've, been at their creative practice for much longer than I have voice something similar. And you seem to often be really determined to pass on the torch. You talk about this. I think I really am moved by the fact that you're thinking so intergenerationally. And what would you ideally like for this new generation to achieve that you feel you and your generation haven't? Because from where I'm standing, like fully indebted to all of you, it seems to me like we could never really achieve what you all did. So I'd love to, maybe you could talk about that and we can open it up to, before you answer, I just want to say that Kenny and I were really interested in starting the conversation with anyone who identifies as disabled. So if you can put your questions in the chat as Kenny does this answer, and we'll open the conversation a little bit bigger. And they don't just have to be questions. Also, we're really open to people just sort of sharing an experience or a thought that, you know, is related to any of this too. So.
Yeah, when you first proposed, you know, Alice and I did some work on exchanging some possible questions to ask each other. And when you came up with that question, I was extremely moved by it. And I've been thinking about it a lot, and I could only I want to give a context to it by talking about what I heard from two other people, and how that made me think. I was lucky to have a residency at the Rockefeller Foundation, the Bellagio Center, and one of the fellow residents was Dikgang Moseneke, who was the deputy, I always get it wrong, he was the deputy Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of South Africa. He was also Nelson Mandela's executor of his estate, and was Winnie Mandela's lawyer. And he was talking at dinner one night, and he said that, he joined the African, you know, the ANC, the African National Congress, when he was 14 years old. And I asked him why he did that at 14. And he said very clearly, without hesitation, that he wanted to make sure that he didn't live his life as a slave, and that he wanted to see the change made during his lifetime. Mm-hmm. And I was just floored by what he said, because at that moment, I realized that I will never in my lifetime see what I imagine, what I want for disabled people. Mm. And then, a little bit time later, Masha Gessen wrote an article in the New Yorker about being present at the Supreme Court arguments of the big case on transgender rights. Mm-hmm. She said the same thing. She said, they, I think Masha goes by they. Masha said that they didn't think in their lifetime they would see the rights for transgender people, you know, where they wanted it to be. And I wrote to Masha, who I know, and I said, I have a story I want to tell you, and I'm going to be in New York. We have to meet to talk about it. And I wanted to tell her what Dikgang had said at Bellagio. So I realized that I will not have that in my lifetime. So I pass it on to people you know, of your generation. You're around 20 years younger than I am, and other people, to have that fruition of these things that I would like to see. That's what I think of. You know, I don't think of what I've done. I mean, I don't think I'm a failure in any way, but I don't think that it's not where I want it to be. It's not where I want it to be for disability culture. It's not for disability rights, even though we have the ADA in the United States. And the UN Charter around the world, which has not been ratified by the United States. I don't think it's laws I'm looking for. It's representation. It's the different kind of narratives. It's that sort of thing. I mean, and the pandemic has just totally flew me back to how bad things really are. For, you know, it just can be turned back badly so easily. Yeah. So I hope that answers somewhat.
Yeah. I mean, I'm also moved by like having this conversation, and, you know, we have been having a conversation like this for a bit. And so let me look at okay, so we have a bunch of questions. Perel asked a question.
About disabled about the proposition of disabled gatekeepers.
Yeah.
I would like all gatekeepers to be disabled. At this point, we have very few in the mainstream, you know, whatever you want to call the mainstream. It's just something that I would love to see. I mean, that's an example of what I would love to see the new generation working, you know, younger generation working towards, becoming the gatekeepers. You know, not only for disabled artists, but for all artists. So I think that would make a very big difference. We don't have that.
Yeah. I mean, I will say my students are, you know, maybe there's not a 20-year difference between us, I don't think. Actually, maybe there is. And it's pretty remarkable to see to see their empowerment, the fluidity with which language and expectations around accessibility within classrooms, and like there is a demand, and a very empowered demand that I am so moved by. And so you can see just these like incremental, like, you know, if we're talking about generations, like these incremental sort of demands and expectations of like it being normal, which is really great, I think.
Yes. Somebody came up to me after a panel in the Netherlands a few years ago and said, "You need to be patient." And I said, "Patient?" I said, "Why should I be patient?" I mean, you would use the word incremental, and that made me, you know, that just, you know, reminded me of, you know, I don't have time to be patient. Yeah. You know, I'm 60 years old already, you know. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a question. Can panelists speak to how anti-racism is connected to access in content and form? Yeah, I mean, I think that we're talking a lot about intersectionality, right? And, you know, it's, I think if you've seen Crip Camp, that like, I loved so much the segment where the Black Panthers came in and supported all of the people who were protesting or on strike. And I just feel like that the connection between race and disability is so close in terms of shared concerns, shared desires. So, and yet also I realize that, like, you know, I'm becoming more and more aware of the way that race is being talked about in the deaf community, and it's not a small thing. There's lots and lots of contention there, and but I do think it's antithetical to, personally, I just think it's antithetical to issues of access if it's not an anti-racist, anti-ableist. Like, to me, those two go so hand in hand. It's almost like impossible to separate them, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned to you that I start most of my classes in disability representation and workshops that I do with my, you know, creative graduate, MFA students, my writing students, with Lynn Manning's poem, The Magic Wand, which I think is just a great work about intersectionality between being a Black man and a disabled man, and how the view of the gaze from the outside sees that. Mm-hmm. And it's been a seminal thing that I think about all the time. It frames so much of what I think about. And you know, I met Lynn at the Chautauqua back in 1994, and I wish that his work was known more, not only his poetry but his plays. Lynn was also a blind judo champion, which I thought was, you know, very, very interesting. But I also hear a lot what Leroy Moore talks about the way disabled Black men are treated by non-disabled Black community as well. And yeah. I think that's a subject that, you know, that I think is really important to be talked about more and written about more.
Well, we're getting a notice that we should wrap up. So I know Krista said in the very beginning that a follow-up email will go out. So in that email, we'll send the links. And I think that we should include that poem and anything that Leroy Moore has written. And so we'll gather that, and then everybody will receive that information. Thank you, Kenny. I feel like this conversation could be like 4 hours long, but
60 years, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Creative Capital, and thank you everybody who came in, even though we can't see you and have no idea how many of you are out there, but thank you for sharing time with us, and thank you, Kenny. It's always amazing to speak with you.
Thank you, Alison. Have a good night, everyone.
And thank you, Trisha, and thank you, Letitia.
Yeah.